Hello, everyone. Welcome to this GFEI seminar. My name is Sara Gonzalez. I'm a professor at the School of Geography at the University of Leeds, and I'm going to be chairing this seminar today. I'm also an associate director of the Global Food and Environment Institute, GFEI, who's hosting this seminar. Quickly, my areas of expertise are I work on urban food systems, food justice. I'm interested in traditional markets, retail markets, but also gentrification, urban justice. These are some of the areas I do research on. However, today is not really about me, it's about Andy's work. And it's really a pleasure for me to introduce this virtual seminar of the Global Food and Environment Institute on neighborhood inequalities in access to food stores, which will be presented by Dr. Andy Newing. Andy is a colleague at the School of Geography, University of Leeds. He's an associate professor in applied spatial analysis. So today's seminar is hosted by the Global Food and Environment Institute. So I'll say a few words about that so you get an idea of who we are. We are an interdisciplinary research community, which brings together members from across academia, industry, and public policy, and across the university from very different academic disciplines, from biology to nutrition to geography as well, to work on integrated challenges of food security and climate change, amongst others. You can visit our website for more information. We have been holding these lunchtime seminars for 4 years now. So we are part of a series of seminars. Please check out also on the chat. There's going to be some links where you can follow us. You can check our GFEI website, and you can also check all the other seminars that we've been holding in the last few years. They're all recorded on YouTube. So that's a wonderful resource for you all. Okay, so we got about 68 people now, so we're letting people in, but that's already a wonderful number. Before I introduce Andy, before I give him the floor, I would like to remind you of the seminar etiquette. So please ensure that your cameras and microphones are switched off for the duration of the seminar. It's a short presentation, okay, so it's a lunchtime type presentation. It will be about 20 minutes. We are keen that you use the chat function to feedback, to ask some questions. We probably won't have time for having live questions where you come on with your microphone, but what we will do is that we will try to group all your questions or take them in sections and answer as many as we can. If we don't get to answer all the questions, Andy, I'm sure, is happy to follow up with people, and you can find his contact details. So I think that's all for in terms of some of the introductions. So yeah, very much looking forward to hearing about Andy's work. So yeah, please, Andy, go ahead.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. And thank you to the GFEI for hosting this webinar. As Sarah said, I'm Andy Newing. I'm a geographer based here at the University of Leeds. And I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about a body of ongoing work that myself and colleagues and PhD students have been engaged in for 5 or so years. And broadly, that's on the theme of neighbourhood-level inequalities in access to food stores. But particularly, I'm going to think today about whether online groceries and particularly fulfillment of online groceries orders from branded convenience stores could help alleviate contemporary food deserts. So let's start by thinking a little bit about the traditional food deserts that many of you are probably aware of. These hit the media and policy focus in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And they were an urban phenomenon. And at the time, we understood that there were a number of typically inner city deprived neighbourhoods where residents struggled to access fresh, healthy and affordable food and drink from supermarkets and grocery stores. And that was largely a product of the move of grocery stores to out-of-town sites during their boom period in the 1980s and early 1990s. And that meant that many residents of inner city deprived neighbourhoods, particularly those with lower rates of mobility, found that their local stores closed and that they didn't have good access to fresh, healthy and affordable food. Leeds became one of the sites that was heavily featured in the analysis and in some of the solutions to to urban food deserts in the 90s. The Seacroft estate, a former council estate in East Leeds, became the focus for a lot of the case study work, and also for some of the solutions with the opening of a large Tesco Extra to try and alleviate some of the urban food desert conditions in that area. And that was the subject of work by colleagues here at the University of Leeds. Now, in the 25 or so years since then, access to food in urban neighbourhoods, and indeed in deprived neighbourhoods, has improved quite considerably. Planning policy changes mean that retailers have had to adapt their store formats for urban centres and edge of centre sites. We've had a growth in branded convenience stores, Tesco Express, Sainsbury's Local, and so on, which also typically provide accessible opportunities for shopping for food and drink in many urban and suburban areas. The rise of the discounters, particularly Aldi and Lidl, often targeted and favoured some of the deprived inner city communities, and also the growth in the use of online groceries has given consumers another opportunity to shop for food and drink, even if they're not physically proximate to a grocery store. So we could say that a large part of the urban food deserts issue has been addressed through innovation on the supply side. But we definitely find that residents of rural communities still suffer compared to their urban counterparts with poorer access to grocery shopping opportunities. The UK Food Security Report, which was published at the end of last year, recognised that residents of some of the more remote rural neighbourhoods across the UK typically travelled an average of about 265 additional miles per year compared to their urban counterparts in order to undertake their everyday food and drink shopping. This obviously has implications in terms of people's time. There's a financial cost involved in making those journeys, and inevitably there's an environmental cost as well. So where you live, and particularly that urban-rural divide, has a huge impact on your ability to access groceries, food stores selling healthy and affordable food. Now, it could be argued that online groceries have improved access to food and drink in rural areas. There's a competing set of theories and evidence out there about the role of online groceries in addressing this need. But the UK Food Security Report that I mentioned earlier, published at the end of last year, presented data that suggested that uptake of online groceries is highest in some of the rural and semi-rural communities. And that would suggest that those communities are using online groceries as a mechanism to transfer some of what we call the last mile costs in making those journeys to a food store back onto the retailer. And therefore the retailer faces those additional travel costs and time and distance in order to deliver groceries to the consumer at home. However, online groceries are not available universally across all neighbourhoods or all neighbourhood types, unlike other forms of goods that can be delivered through the postal service. Ultimately, retailers make commercial decisions about where they offer their online groceries service. And in doing so, retailers are having to make complex decisions about how much of those last mile costs, the cost in delivering orders to the consumer, they're willing to take on. Typically, in a UK context, online groceries orders are picked and packed and dispatched from a large format supermarket that's close to where that demand is. And so most of the large supermarkets in retailers' chains in the UK have a fleet of delivery vehicles that are based at the store and that have in-store shifts of pickers and packers who assemble those orders ready for dispatch. The retailer therefore determines the amount of investment it's willing and able to put into that service, and therefore determines the capacity at the level of an individual store. How many orders can be picked and stored on a given day? How many orders can be delivered to consumers based on the number of delivery vehicles and the number of drivers that are available? And as a result of those constraints, retailers therefore determine a catchment area or a service area over which they are willing to provide those deliveries. They determine how far they're willing for those delivery vehicles to drive, how much time they're willing to spend in servicing some of the demand that may be some distance from that store. And that decision probably depends on the volume of demand in different drive time catchments around the store. But ultimately, it means that there's a commercial decision here about which neighbourhoods to serve, and inevitably, some neighbourhoods will be unserved. A couple of years ago, myself and colleagues undertook a web scraping exercise to understand the delivery coverage that was offered by all of the major players that offered an online groceries service. We took one postcode from every lower super output area in England and Wales, or data zone in Scotland. And in total, there were around about 42,000 of these. And they're akin to a neighbourhood, typically containing about 1,500 people. We put one postcode from each of those zones into the delivery checker on each of 8 different grocers' websites. And we recorded the result. And essentially that result is, yes, we deliver groceries to your neighbourhood. Please start building your order. Or no, sorry, we don't deliver to your area. And we found that there were huge spatial inequalities in the coverage of online groceries, and that this obviously varied by retailer. The example I've got on the screen here is Asda, who have pretty comprehensive coverage across England, Wales, and Scotland, with only outlying areas in the Scottish Highlands and Islands that are not covered. And the pattern was relatively similar for Tesco, not shown here, and Sainsbury's, shown on the right-hand side. Other retailers had more patchy coverage. Morrison's, for example, had pretty good coverage at the time across much of England, although there were pockets, particularly in rural areas, that they didn't cover, but they had less coverage across much of rural and mid-Wales and across much of the Scottish mainland and the Highlands and Islands. And smaller players like Iceland, who perhaps target predominantly urban areas, had a much more urban focus to their delivery catchment. And we did this across all of the major retailers, and it showed huge urban-rural inequalities. And it's not just nice to be able to have online groceries coverage in the neighbourhood in which you live. The Competition and Markets Authority, our competition regulator, has recognised that this is a really important aspect of consumer choice. And so availability and choice of delivery provider is deemed important from a consumer perspective. Now, myself and colleagues took the output from this web scraping exercise and we combined it with a whole suite of other information on neighbourhood characteristics and neighbourhood-level access to traditional grocery retail opportunities. And that included supermarkets and convenience stores. And combining those data sources, we produced something known as the eFood Deserts Index, a small area composite measure that captured contemporary food desert-like characteristics at the neighbourhood level. That data set and some commentary and analysis around it is freely available for wider reuse through the Consumer Data Research Centre website hosted here at the University of Leeds. And some of the commentary provides more detail on the methodology that was used and some of the more nuanced patterns that are evident in the output from that. But the key takeaway message from that is that the rural residents, rural neighbourhoods faced a dual disadvantage. In many cases, they already suffered from comparatively poorer access to physical retail provision. And on top of that, they tended to have either no delivery coverage for online groceries or typically lack of choice in online groceries provider. And so in terms of contemporary food deserts, online groceries appears to be creating new spatial inequalities rather than providing improved access to groceries for everyone. Let's think a little bit about some of the challenges in improving coverage of online groceries. During the COVID pandemic, there were lots of headlines about the uptake in online groceries by us as consumers, and also the efforts that the retailers were making in order to service that demand. And largely in servicing that demand, in boosting their e-groceries capacity, the grocers were adding additional capacity at existing points within their online groceries network. So they were recruiting more pickers and packers. They were adding more delivery vehicles at the stores that were currently serving online groceries orders. expanding online groceries beyond the store network is really challenging. And that's really a product of the fact that our predominant mode of online groceries fulfillment is store-based. A PhD student that myself and colleague Nick Hood supervised, Brian Urquhart, did a lot of work looking at the online groceries network for one major retailer, Sainsbury's. And he found that to expand beyond the existing coverage was near impossible because that retailer simply didn't have a store network that stretched far enough into those underserved areas. And so without building new large format stores, which really hasn't been the model that retailers have been using over the last decade or so, it's very, very difficult to improve the reach of online groceries into those underserved areas. And the strategies to do so could include retailers having to face more extreme last mile costs, sending delivery vehicles much further from the store that's supplying that order, possibly adding in additional fulfillment stores, but I've just noted that that hasn't really been the predominant mode of growth in this sector, or we might simply have to accept that there'll always be some gaps in coverage. Now, there have been examples of retailers who've been willing to face exceptional last mile costs in order to meet consumer demand. Morrisons provide typically a daily delivery service to consumers on the Isle of Skye. Their online grocery service to the Isle of Skye, I believe, is fulfilled from their Fort William store, and therefore the vehicles that are making those deliveries are facing a 2-ish hour each way journey and about a 200-mile round trip to the Isle of Skye in order to deliver these consumer orders. So consumer demand is clearly there, and these orders are delivered to a central delivery point in a council-run car park in Portree on the Isle of Skye, and consumers then come to that car park to collect their orders. So the demand is clearly there, and retailers are clearly keen to tap into that demand to enable them to grow their online groceries service and indeed to provide fresh, healthy and affordable food and drink to more communities. Now, if you don't want to go down the route that Morrisons are going down and facing those last mile costs, what might the other solutions be? Well, if we're not opening new stores, then one solution could be to use online fulfillment centres or dark stores. Now, the best example of those that are out there is the online fulfillment centres or dark stores that are used by Ocado. But these are multi-million-pound investments. They're very high-tech picking and packing sites that are used to dispatch those orders to consumers, and they're really only suitable for locations where high density, high volume urban demand is being served. There are examples of retailers who've trialled much smaller format online fulfillment centres or dark stores. Getir was a great example of that. Getir are a Turkish grocer who expanded quite rapidly across many European countries, focusing on what's termed Q-commerce or quick commerce. They had an app-based ordering system that allowed consumers to order a basket full of goods for near immediate delivery. And I think the target time for Getir was about 20 minutes. In the UK, they expanded across a number of cities, including London, Birmingham, and Manchester. And in order to fulfill those orders very, very quickly, they needed to put their online fulfillment centres very close to where the consumer demand was located. So rather than going for these large format warehouses that someone like Ocado uses, they created micro fulfillment hubs about the size of a convenience store that were located very close to where consumer demand was located. And that enabled them to service these orders incredibly quickly. Now, Getir have exited the UK market along with a number of other European markets to focus on growth in their home market of Turkey. But other retailers and delivery partners are trialling this format of micro hubs. Deliveroo runs its own grocery delivery service called Deliveroo Hop, and this is one of their micro fulfillment hubs on Oxford Street in London. This is a courier pickup point, but it's also open to consumers who can place an order online or in McDonald's style kiosks inside, and it will be picked and packed and presented to them. It's not like a store that a consumer can walk around. Now, these micro fulfillment hubs could possibly offer the chance to expand online groceries into rural areas. And just to be absolutely clear, I'm not for one moment suggesting that this notion of quick commerce or Q-commerce would be applicable to rural areas. There isn't the network of drivers and couriers, and there probably isn't the demand. But certainly this demonstrates that those micro-fulfillment hubs can be used to pick and pack orders for delivery within the local area. And in an article I wrote for The Conversation a couple of years ago, I very much argued that smaller format online fulfillment centres could offer potential to expand online groceries into rural areas. But perhaps we don't really need to go down this route of building bespoke dark stores or warehouses, because many retailers already have a network of convenience stores that stretch well into rural and semi-rural areas that could be used for online order fulfillment. The main player in this market is the Co-op. They have over 2,500 convenience stores across Great Britain, more than any of their competitors. And they've got about a third of the quick commerce market. They're on all the major platforms, Deliveroo, Uber Eats, and Just Eat. And that demonstrates that within their stores, they carry the stock range, they have the capacity, they have the staffing ability in order to pick and prepare orders that are being delivered by Q-commerce. And therefore, there's no reason why they couldn't do that for more traditional online groceries as well. Let's have a look at a little example of the sort of stretch and reach of Co-op stores within Scotland. I noted that on the eFood Deserts Index and our web scraping exercise of delivery coverage, that it was Scottish Highlands and Islands in particular that had comparatively poor coverage by the major players. Co-op is a really important part of the retail supply side in much of Scotland, including the Highlands and Islands. They run about a quarter of all of the food stores in Scotland, and around a quarter of those are within rural areas. And almost 1 in 10 are in some of the most remote areas. So they already have the stretch across many of the areas that are traditionally underserved by online groceries, and indeed by other forms of physical retail provision for food and drink. Some brief drive time analysis that I've undertaken to look at the reach that these stores might have into some of the rural areas, looking at just a 15-minute drive time. And of course, in many cases, grocers are willing to deliver groceries over travel times that extend beyond 15 minutes from your fulfillment store. But if we take that 15-minute drive time as a very conservative example, Co-op stores in Scotland alone reach almost 97% of what we're calling the accessible rural population, based on the Scottish rural-urban classification, and just over 60% of the remote rural population. And as I say, if we were to perhaps rerun that at 30 minutes, we would find that their reach into those remote areas was even stronger. Now, we're in an era where convenience stores are really the key competitive element among many of the grocers. And in the last 10 years or so, the number of convenience stores in Great Britain has almost doubled, and the proportion of those stores that are in rural areas has grown as well. And there's actually over 1,000 convenience stores that are in neighbourhoods that would be classed as remote or very remote. And a number of the major players have very ambitious expansion plans at the moment for their convenience store network. And this can only be a good thing for expanding the reach of online groceries and for improving accessibility to healthy, fresh and affordable food. So to sum up then, first of all, to note that this is work in progress, and I'm really keen on collaboration. So if anyone who's involved in this webinar would be interested in collaborating further around any of these themes, then please do get in touch, and myself and colleagues would be delighted to have a chat with you. But the takeaway message from where we're at so far is that online groceries can be a really important mechanism to reduce some of the urban-rural inequalities in access to food. And yet, in its traditional format, fulfilled from large format supermarkets, there are supply-side challenges that prohibit the expansion of these services so that they have the reach and the coverage into some of the most remote areas. We know from the quick commerce market that convenience stores have the capacity, the technology, and the stock range to fulfill online orders. And the growth in branded convenience stores really has huge potential to improve access to food and drink in rural areas. And that Scottish example shows the reach that these stores have into some of those most remote communities. And so if we can move towards a model whereby these convenience stores are used for more traditional online order fulfillment in some of the more remote and rural areas, it may well be possible to extend the benefits of online groceries to more communities and therefore help to address some of this inequality and imbalance in access to fresh, healthy, and affordable food. That's all I wanted to say. I think I've gone over by 2 minutes, for which I apologise, but hopefully we've still got time for some Q&A. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Andy. Okay, so I can see one question in the chat so far. Please don't be shy. Just drop your questions there. Maybe while we gather a few more questions, I can start off by asking. I had one question, Andy. That was really, really interesting. My question was, given that you mentioned a few times that these are obviously the retailers are making the decisions on a commercial basis. So we're always going to have the challenge that they might decide that it's not commercially viable, or with one of your examples of that Turkish retailer just drop out. So is there what's the role here for the state or policy to perhaps cover some of these market failure? Would there be any policies that could somehow promote or make retailers do certain things? Have you explored that?
That's a really good question. And it's a bit of a tricky area because generally the thing we try and maintain is competition in these markets. And there's been a number of Competition and Markets Authority investigations and inquiries into the groceries sector. And that's all about providing competition in order to ensure better prices and things like that for consumers. We know that in many of these rural areas, consumers are limited to a single retailer, whether that's a physical store or whether that's in online groceries. And there isn't really evidence of the state intervening there to force or even encourage other retailers to open. And indeed, as part of the planning process, retailers have to prove that there is a quantitative need for additional retail floor space and for additional retail facilities. What we do know is that during the COVID pandemic, the government did bring in some legislation that encouraged or enabled retailers to pool some of their capacity in delivery vehicles in order to try and meet some of the increased demand during that period. I don't know whether there was any evidence that legislation was ever enacted, whether any retailers did share capacity, but that sort of thing could be a mechanism that would make the provision of some of these services more affordable in rural areas if retailers were encouraged to, or even chose to work together to try and share delivery capacity and share those last mile costs.
Okay, thanks. So we gave time to people to put some questions up there. I don't know if you can see them. Some of them are requests to maybe share data or give a bit more information about the data that you've used. So is there an option to download the score data per super output areas of the eFood Desert Index? Emma has a question. She has experience of trying to convince retailers to stop where she lives because she sees vans passing around her nearby. So is there an appetite for retailers to actually improve this coverage? That's another question. Another question is, have you looked at differences in price of a healthy basket by retailers and convenience stores? I mean, I had a related question because maybe I don't, obviously I'm not you're an expert in this area, so you might not be understanding very well, but these convenience stores tend to store less healthy food, right? So, but maybe you're not saying that they would deliver what they got there already, but convenience stores tend to store a lot of ultra processed food. So I don't know if this has any links.
All great questions. Do you want me to start answering those?
Let's go for those, yes.
Okay, let's start with the last one then. So around, whether convenience stores are really suitable for a sort of healthy and an affordable diet. I'll combine those two. I think traditionally, the convenience market has been a very fragmented one, and it's been characterized by poor quality, and yeah, absolutely ultra processed food, expensive food, lack of fresh food, and so on. I think it's fair to say that since the major retailers entered this market, they've upped standards considerably. They've been able to use their supply chains to ensure that there are fresh and healthy food options. And particularly some of the newer convenience stores that retailers are launching at the moment, they've got much more of a mission-focused layout. And so there is the grab and go snack food for now. There is sort of ready meals for tonight, but there is also a focus on fresh and healthy food. And on the pricing front, again, traditionally these stores have been more expensive. As part of work that has been completed here at the Consumer Data Research Centre, and actually that used the eFood Deserts Index as an input, something called the Priority Places for Food tool was produced, which was part of which is Affordable Food for All campaign. And one part of that campaign was around parity in terms of pricing for healthy food options and offers and things between convenience stores and the larger supermarkets operated by those brands. And I know that a number of the major retailers have now pledged to match their prices between their convenience stores and their supermarkets. So I think that historically there has been criticism of this sector, but I think the growth of branded convenience stores and perhaps more of a willingness on the part of the supermarkets to be seen to be doing the right thing means that some of those concerns are perhaps less prominent now. Some of the other questions there, a quick and easy one. Yes, the eFood Deserts Index is available for wider reuse. It can be downloaded from the Consumer Data Research Centre website. It's available to view in their interactive map, but you can also download the underlying data. And if you are keen to use that in a particular context and want to have a chat with me about that, I'd be more than willing to do so, and very keen for that to be reused more widely. And in time, hopefully, to be able to update some of the data that goes into it. And the final question in that set that you put to me, Sarah, is there an appetite on the part of the retailers to improve coverage? Well, ultimately, they're making commercial decisions. And so wherever improving coverage will allow them to tap into more of their target consumer type and therefore gain market share and revenue, then there's definitely a keenness to do so. But I think there's perhaps also a recognition that there is a limit to the investment that can be made, particularly for serving very remote and rural communities where there just isn't the volume of demand. And ultimately, these will always be commercial decisions. I know that I had discussions with one of the major retailers who has pretty comprehensive coverage, and they didn't have any plans to expand their coverage to the very small proportion of the population that were not served. But as I sort of said in that presentation, we've done collaborative work with Sainsbury's, who were very interested in how they could optimize their network. And one part of optimizing the network is enabling expansion of that network for obvious commercial reasons.
Okay, thanks very much. I think if somebody wants to check whether when we say convenience stores, we're talking about the smaller formats of Tesco. I think that's the case.
Yes, correct.
They're saying that in their area, this doesn't always necessarily mean unhealthy food, which I think you've already answered. A couple of questions here, which are a broader picture, which are, you kind of, some of these suggestions are just propping out the existing food system, which has all kinds of problems. So suggestion here from Rose, what about looking into more alternative community existing projects, community food projects, like for example, she's got some examples, food hubs, pantries. Could this be a way of covering those gaps? So that's one example, which would try to move us away a little bit from the existing food system, which is, this is my own take now, might have initially, created these problems. Can you explain how was the household coverage and population calculated? What was the data set? That's one question. You have also a suggestion for somebody to collaborate with in labs in our university. Could micro-fulfillment hubs be an effective way to support local food producers and shorten the supply chain? Yeah, we haven't talked so much about the links between producers and consumers. At the moment, that chain is very, very, very long, isn't it? And it involves a supermarket. So again, how could we perhaps that is another question about more generally, how do we move away from existing food system and improve it? Those are big questions. So some big questions and some other more specific ones.
Yeah, and all, again, very interesting questions. I'm conscious we haven't got a lot of time, so I'll try and run through these fairly quickly. And certainly, I take on board the comments about sort of producers and consumers and the role of micro hubs within that system. I'm not an expert in that. I don't know that there's a lot I can add to that in the time that we've got. The more technical question, the household coverage, as I said, we took one postcode per lower super output area and identified whether a retailer delivered to that postcode. And if they did, we assumed they delivered to all households within that lower super output area. And we used mid-year population estimates for those lower super output areas, along with urban-rural classification and also deprivation type data to really understand some of the spatial and indeed the social inequalities in coverage of these services. And the broader question around sort of community food retailing and whether that can plug these gaps. Yeah, absolutely it can. And I know that in many communities it does. Two challenges really in incorporating that and in thinking about that within this broader system. The first is the fragmented nature of that sector, which means that actually obtaining data and understanding the coverage of those is more challenging. And also perhaps the fragmented nature of that provision, which may be community and volunteer-led, may have limited opening hours, may have shocks in the supply chain that means that it doesn't always have access to the full range of goods. And, for all of the concerns that people perhaps have around the sort of growth of the branded convenience stores, they generally do have long opening hours, 7 days a week, and they have a robust supply chain. So they typically provide all of the goods that people need fairly reliably 7 days a week.
I don't see any more specific questions unless I'm missing something out. I mean, on that last point on community provisioning, I think one of the issue with food desert research is that, yeah, it tends to look at this data, and of course, it might miss out on things that are not available on the data, such as, for example, these perhaps community initiatives. So that's a general problem, isn't it? How do we make visible things that are there, which could be, as you say, maybe not that reliable, perhaps, but very interesting and offer value in lots of different ways beyond just accessing food. Yep. Any other questions? Or any questions that I've missed? Okay, let's see. Do you know if there is a demand in these more rural areas for healthy, fresh food? And how would this be measured?
Yeah, that's a great question. The demand seems to be there because, well, we know that there's some gaps on the supply side. We know that there's a lower density and lower choice of provision in many of these areas. We know from survey-based research and qualitative research in some of these communities that residents do face barriers in accessing healthy, fresh, affordable food, and indeed that they report that they often have to pay more for these. And I think examples like Morrison's providing the online grocery service to the Isle of Skye, where there are other local opportunities to purchase food and drink, demonstrates that there is a demand, a need on the consumer part, either to get better prices and or to get a broader choice of fresh and healthy food. Sarah, you seem to be muted, and your picture's frozen as well.
I am muted. Yeah, I was muted. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yeah.
No, I mean, we're going to finish in a minute, but there was a question earlier that I think it was linked to this previous one. Is it possible to examine how the accessibility improve the nutritional quality, the nutritional health of the residents? Would you be able to make that link between giving more accessibility and improving the health of the residents?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not my area of focus or my area of expertise, but certainly, following those food desert studies in the 1990s and early 2000s, there were lots of localized qualitative studies, particularly in Leeds and also in Cardiff, that looked at the change in dietary patterns as a result of investment in food store provision. So I think that link is relatively well established, albeit some of that literature is more dated.
There's a question here about the definition of a food desert. I know you can talk about this. So Anna Douglas is asking, is there a working definition of food deserts? Paradoxically, high immigrant areas where household income might prompt definitions of deprivation have many more scale fresh food stores, while middle-class suburbs have none. So yeah, what's the definition? We just let everyone know, this is probably the last question, so we'll finish in a couple of minutes, but that's a good one to end on.
Yeah, great one to end on. I don't know of a definitive definition. There have been various definitions used by government and by policy action tasks and so on over the years. Essentially, it's a neighbourhood that lacks good access to fresh, healthy and affordable food. And it's normally a combination of the supply side characteristics, so the actual provision of food stores, and also the ability of the population to interact with those. And that will encompass things like personal mobility, income levels, so some sort of link to deprivation there. So yeah, essentially some sort of barrier that restricts the interaction between demand and supply.
Okay, that's great. And I think Andy said he's very happy to collaborate with people looking for collaboration. So please get in touch with him. And there's lots of information there about GFEI and how can you follow us on different social media channels and the YouTube channels. You will all receive a recording of these and of this presentation. So yeah, great to hear from you, Andy, and lots of people came. So of great interest in your research. Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. And we'll leave it here.
Super, thank you.
Bye. So we stop the recording now then.